Verklärte Nacht was written in 1899 in a period of about 3 weeks, and the piece is around half an hour long, and a general good rule of thumb for a composer is to produce around 3 minutes of music a week. So this is quite an extraordinary output, and the only thing that could have motivated this is really passion, and Schoenberg was deeply passionate about a woman, no doubt. Her name was Matilda von Zemlensky. The piece itself is based around a poem by Dehmel that was written 3 years ago. So it had had some time to mature, and the poem itself is very scandalous. We've attached a copy of the poem below for you to read for yourself, but it deals with themes that in the sort of late Victorian era were exceedingly topical and difficult for people to sort of talk about openly with one another. So in this way, Schoenberg promotes discussion about themes that otherwise wouldn't have happened, such as sexuality and sexual intercourse outside of wedlock, and of course, pregnancy, as is a huge theme in the piece, which also makes it a very odd gift for his love, his lady love, who he would go on to marry, Matilda, because he's written this very strange, bizarre piece about a woman who has ultimately committed what is seen as a grave offence, and her partner then tells her that it's okay and comforts her. So the overall message of the piece is definitely positive. The piece itself is one of Schoenberg's tonal works. You may be familiar with Schoenberg's atonal music, such as Peripatetic, which is commonly studied in our school curriculums today, and is sort of people's introduction to Schoenberg. But his earlier tonal music is also very beautiful and pushes the boundaries between tonality and atonality, which is something I think we'd like to discuss. And now I'd like to open up the floor to our music scholars to discuss tonality and atonality further. Anoushka, do you have any thoughts on tonality and atonality in relation to this piece by Schoenberg?
Well, I think one of the most exciting things about this piece is that the chords are so complicated, but they're definitely untangleable. And this makes me curious about where would I draw the line between tonality and atonality? And if I choose a place to draw the line, would people agree with me? Because I guess in my view, I'd say Schoenberg is someone who reached the line at Verklärte Nacht and then kind of overshot a bit.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point, because if you listen to a piece that's absolutely atonal and then one that's obviously tonal, you can make such a distinction because they're very polar. But Schoenberg kind of walks the line in Verklärte Nacht and kind of combines them at different points, so it all becomes blurred together into just this interface of music as opposed to being either or. So it's hard to distinguish because you can kind of hear a melody and a tune at parts, and then it dissipates and fragments and augments in other places, but it's still there.
That's such a good point, because maybe it's the fact in Verklärte Nacht that he actually alternates between tonal and atonal, that you actually really appreciate both.
One of the things that I found really quite difficult to do at first was practice it on my own, because you really need every other part to make sense of the whole thing. Like if you were to just look at the first like almost page of the viola 2 part, it is one note, a drone, that is played with the cello, but you can't appreciate the beauty of the music on your own. You have to bring in the elements of atonality that sort of fit together like puzzle pieces from all of the other parts, which is why I think like ultimately it is quite beautiful.
I'd now like to go over the structure of the piece. As we've said, the structure is really important because Schoenberg uses different motifs and themes to guide us through a musical journey via this poem. It opens with our couple walking very slowly, as we can hear through what Giulia mentioned earlier about the droning cello and violas. They're both on a very low D in their registers, and it creates a very intense atmosphere because few other notes are used until the rest of the ensemble starts getting into action. At that point, when the violins finally come in after a good minute and a half of this very eerie treading They're portraying moonlight. In the poem, it says the moon chases them, depending on your translation. And there's a really beautiful and ethereal effect created that actually continues throughout the piece, as we will see later. But I'll open it up to our scholars for any comment on the opening of the piece.
Yeah, I would say honestly the very opening from, I think it's about 20 bars after I come in, is probably my favorite part of the piece. It's just the arpeggiating bit up to the trill on the high E and the F, and it represents the moonlight, like you were saying. It's just so pretty and it's so fitting because it's so perfectly reflective of what he's trying to portray. It's this moonlight, the glimmering, and it fits so well in the context. And like you said, that's passed throughout the whole piece, throughout the whole ensemble.
I find it very interesting how Schoenberg is able to still portray the very beautiful moonlight, but also still be in keeping with like the eerie themes. So the way that he anchors like the mood and keeps that sort of subtle like darkness through the viola and cello drone is quite special, I think, because the moonlight is so beautiful. So you find yourself listening to that and you're drawn in, but then you are still sort of hearing that viola sort of underscoring the whole mood, and the cello as well, which is quite amazing.
Yeah, I agree. I think it sets the tone incredibly well for the entire piece. And it's just very dark. Like I can completely imagine this foresty landscape with just slimmers of moonlight kind of cutting through the trees, pacing slowly. And I think it describes this scene just incredibly well. So I really agree with what everybody said on this.
And going on from this section, it transitions into a rather turbulent contrapuntal texture. And by this I mean there are two main voices really attacking each other quite fiercely, showing the turmoil that's going on inside our female protagonist's head. It's showing the conflict that she's having over whether or not to tell her partner what's happened, because this really would have been quite scandalous. She would have been, depending on where you lived and the culture surrounding you, you might have been thrown out of your home, possibly even imprisoned, and your life prospects would suddenly look much, much worse. So this is represented by two primary voices played by strings in octaves, with the second viola and second cello playing tremolo to sort of add to this barren, chaotic texture. And this is Schoenberg really conveying a real height of emotion. So I'd like to ask our music scholars whether or not this came across to them in the performance. Do you agree? Did you feel anything else as we were playing it?
I would completely agree with that sentiment behind it. I think the doubling of the voices makes it so like oxymoronic and so comparative in a way. And definitely in my part, when I'm doubling it a lot with the first viola, there's just so many intricacies that create a sense of like anxiety and wailing. There's a lot of portmanteau going up to higher notes that is almost embodying like an internal screech in a way. And this, compared to all the lower aspects, which create that foundation of, a dark and eerie place carrying over from the first section, it really does create just a general mood of anguish and longing and anxiety.
Following on from this tumultuous sort of inner turmoil, we move to a section of confession, and it's represented by this sort of heavily played down bows, and it really is almost similar to the steps in the beginning of the piece. And it's represented by this sort of loud descending chromatic motif that sort of slowly dies away, becomes very, very quiet as she awaits an answer. Ramesh and Alex, you're the key actors in this part, sort of showing this voice. Would you like to comment about how it was playing this?
While the start was definitely my favorite part of the piece melodically and in a musical session, this was my favorite part to actually play because it's so physical and it's so emphatic, and all the down bows are so aggressive in a way, and the harmonic progressions from it, it starts in the major for a bar, goes into the relative minor, then that scales up a semitone, major relative minor. it's so polarizing and it's so emotive.
Yeah, I think kind of like what Ramesh was saying about the turmoil is very relatable. Also, I think it was Ramesh and I in like a pair playing, and then kind of a little conversation with, and it's just kind of like that battle between the two voices. I remember like in rehearsal having to balance it out to make it seem like a real kind of thing, like against each other. And then I think I just love how we have kind of a good few bars of that, and then it just goes straight into the softer section, kind of back to one of the themes we heard at the beginning. um and it just really shows like how like these emotions, they aren't smooth at all. It's kind of all over the place. You're thinking so many things in this type of situation. There's just so much going on.
And after this period of intense darkness and silence, we have a chord, and it's a big D major chord, which is wonderful because the beginning of the piece was in D minor, and to major it's really very obvious to the listener, which is good because sometimes some large harmonic changes are lost to the ear when they're very subtle, but this is very obvious and very big. And there is this absolutely fantastic cello solo that he puts in. And it's meant to represent the voice of the man speaking, comforting her. Now, a modern interpretation of this voice is slightly patronizing and to an extent patriarchal, as we can see the sort of the rational man and the sinful, irrational woman stereotypes being played. But despite the slightly problematic nature of this art, it still manages to convey beauty and relationships to us in a way that I think is really human. And no doubt similar observations will be made of the art that we make today. So I'd like to invite Anoushka to discuss the cello solo and the emotional baggage that comes with it.
You're correct about the kind of paradox thing. Maybe that also kind of represents something unconditional about it. You know, however many clouds there are, you'll always see the sun at the end. This man is maybe saying to this person, you know what, whatever has happened before this, I still love you. Like, however much these chords do not lead to a D major, oh, here it is. But yes, it also was a very terrifying moment for me in the performance because I knew this D major would come along and suddenly I had to like cook up a beautiful cello solo.
And following this sort of tranquility and serenity that comes with it, our perspectives broaden. We no longer are looking at the footsteps or sort of the moonlight coming through the trees to the ground, but our world opens up quite dramatically as we are shown the starlight, which is represented using beautiful effects that were quite revolutionary and unused at that time. We can see this in the fact that Schoenberg notates his harmonics in a strange way to us musicians now, where we're much more familiar with the technique. And this led to much more unraveling and studying of the score carefully to make sure that we're doing what Schoenberg wanted us to do, which I think is a really interesting challenge. Giulia, would you like to discuss sort of the challenges involved in rehearsing this very, very difficult segment? I think it is, from a performance perspective, the most difficult bit of ensemble work that we had to power through.
In rehearsing this section of the piece, it was very difficult to make these thirds happen because you can look at a score and you can see, oh, look, playing thirds can't be that hard. But when I'm actually there trying to put this together, it was so much more counterintuitive than I thought it would be, which was where the difficulty in rehearsal came from, because there was a similar third scale played by the first and second violins, I believe, in the same section. And to them, it sounded so effortless. But when I'm sitting there playing my instrument and I've got someone else playing the other thirds, it sounds to me like I'm not playing the right thing. However, if you're in the sound world of the audience instead, I'm sure it would sound exactly correct and exactly as Schoenberg meant it. So I think it was trying to dissociate from the idea that I was doing it incorrectly because it didn't sound right to me.
Yeah, I think what you're saying was absolutely right, Giulia. It's like there's such a big difference between, say, I don't know, rehearsing your own solo stuff, you know, kind of like learning a concerto movement and just kind of playing it with a piano accompaniment, compared to playing in a group of 6 people and just trusting that you're contributing correctly to just this large group effort and group sound. And it's almost different trying to take a step back and hear it all as a whole as a player.
There are many challenges in rehearsing a piece like Verklärte Nacht. As the conductor, it was my job to help interpreting the score, because players only see their part. They don't see what everyone else is doing. So it's my responsibility to help the players fit together, which is part of how we're able to sort of achieve a very difficult score that even some conservatoires may have potentially encountered challenges. We were able to work together and sort of overcome and understand. The second half of the piece uses a lot of the themes from the first half of the piece and changes them. They're transfigured, and it is during the night. Transfigured night, Verklärte Nacht. And the piece ends in a beautiful starlight motif, very similar to the one that we just discussed, which is, of course, very difficult to play. So thank you, everyone, very much for listening. We hope to see you after the restrictions are lifted and we can finally have in-person concerts. But for the rest of the time being, we are on YouTube. Thank you very much.